The house had been listed for sale for 8 months when the real estate agent finally stopped pretending she could move it. It wasn't the condition. The condition was fine. Freshly painted, cleaned out, the carpets replaced by the estate after the last occupant died. It wasn't the neighborhood. Mercer Lane was a quiet street in a quiet part of a quiet town, the kind of address that should have sold itself. It was the history. Everyone in Harlow County knew what had happened in that house. Or rather, everyone knew what had not happened. What had not been explained. What had not been resolved in 21 years of asking. A woman and her teenage son had walked out of that house on a November evening in 2003 and had not been seen again. No car taken, no bags packed, no phone calls made, no withdrawals from the bank account that held the last of their money. Just gone. The front door had been found standing open in the morning by a neighbor who had noticed the porch light still burning at 7:30 a.m. and felt, in the way that neighbors sometimes feel things before they have language for them, that something was wrong. Inside, 2 plates on the kitchen table, food still on them, not quite cold, the television on, a boy's jacket hung over the back of his chair, the way you hang a jacket when you expect to put it back on in a few minutes. This is the story of Rosalind Vance and her 17-year-old son, Tobias. It is a story about a small town that harbored a large secret, about a family that knew more than it ever said, about the particular way that power, quiet, local, deeply embedded power, can make certain things invisible for a very long time, and about a detective who refused, long after everyone else had moved on, to let invisible things stay that way. If this is your first time here, this channel exists for the cases that deserve more than silence. Subscribe and hit the bell. These stories need to be told, and they need to be heard. Meredith Cale had not spoken to her sister Rosalind in 6 weeks when Rosalind disappeared. They had argued, a real argument, the kind with raised voices and things said that couldn't be taken back, over the situation with Garrett, over what Rosalind was going to do about it, over whether Rosalind understood what she was involving herself in and whether she grasped fully the kind of man she was dealing with and the kinds of things that kind of man was capable of. Rosalind had told Meredith to stay out of it. Meredith had told Rosalind she was making a mistake. Rosalind had hung up the phone. 6 weeks later, on a Tuesday in mid-November, when the first hard frost of the season had silvered every surface on Mercer Lane and the bare trees stood black against a white sky, Meredith received a call from the Harlow County Sheriff's Department informing her that her sister's home had been found open and unoccupied, and that neither Rosalind nor Tobias could be located. Meredith sat down on her kitchen floor when the call ended. She did not do it deliberately. Her legs simply stopped holding her. She stayed there for a long time. The argument replayed itself. The things she hadn't said clearly enough. The things she had said, and Rosalind had dismissed. The name she had wanted to report to someone and had not reported because Rosalind had begged her not to, had said it would make everything worse, had said she could handle it herself and that Meredith needed to trust her. Meredith had trusted her. She would spend the next 21 years understanding that trust, what it had cost, what it had meant, whether it had been the right thing to give or the worst mistake she had ever made. The two positions were irreconcilable, and she had lived inside both of them simultaneously for 2 decades, and the weight of that double occupancy had shaped her into a different person than the one she had been in 2003. The name she had not reported was Garrett Pell. In 2003, Garrett Pell was the Deputy County Commissioner of Harlow County. He was 54 years old. He had been in county government in one form or another since 1986. He was married to a woman named Sylvia. He had 3 adult children. He attended the First Methodist Church on the first and third Sunday of every month and had for 30 years. His name was on 2 buildings in town, the Pell Community Center, funded by a donation he had made in 2001, and the Pell Agricultural Scholarship administered through the county high school. He was, in the language of small towns, a fixture, a landmark, the kind of person around whom the architecture of a community organizes itself so completely that imagining the community without him requires a fundamental act of imagination. Rosalind Vance had known something about Garrett Pell. Meredith knew that much. She did not know exactly what. Rosalind had been careful, even with her, had given shape without content, had said, "If anything happens to me, look at Garrett Pell," had said it in the specific way people say things they hope will never need to be used. When Meredith told the investigating officers about Garrett Pell 3 days after the disappearance, she was interviewed once, politely, and told that all leads would be followed up appropriately. Garrett Pell was interviewed. He was cooperative, composed, and had an alibi for the evening in question provided by 4 individuals, 2 of whom were county employees. The lead went nowhere. Meredith knew from the moment it went nowhere that it had been steered there. She just couldn't prove it, not yet. The town of Harlow had a population of just under 9,000 and the specific quality of smallness that is less about size than about density. The way everyone's life presses against everyone else's, the way information moves through a community like water through close-packed earth, finding channels, pooling in certain places, going dry in others. Rosalind Vance had lived in Harlow for 14 years by the time she disappeared. She had arrived in 1989 at the age of 29, following a brief and unhappy marriage to a man named Derek Vance who had grown up in the county and wanted to come back to it. She had come from a mid-sized city 3 hours east, where she had worked in the records office of a regional hospital, and the adjustment to Harlow's particular social density had taken her several years and a considerable amount of quiet determination. Derek left in 1995 when Tobias was 9. He moved to another state, maintained inconsistent contact with his son for 2 years, and then ceased contact altogether. Rosalind did not pursue him for child support with the aggression she might have, partly because the legal process exhausted her, and partly because she had decided, in the particular way of certain self-sufficient people, that assistance from a person who did not want to give it was not assistance worth having. She raised Tobias on her income from the hospital records office, which was modest, and from a part-time position doing bookkeeping for 3 small businesses in town, which supplemented it enough that they managed. They lived on Mercer Lane in a house she rented from a property management company, 2 bedrooms, a small yard, a kitchen that got the afternoon light. It was the kind of home that becomes genuinely comfortable through the accumulation of small personalizations. Curtains chosen carefully, plants in the window, Tobias's drawings from elementary school still pinned to the board in the hallway, long past the age when he found them embarrassing. People who knew Rosalind in Harlow described her consistently as competent and private. Not cold, no one used that word, but measured. Careful with what she gave out and to whom. Her close circle was small. Meredith, who visited several times a year from the city. A woman named Patrice Odom, who worked at the school where Tobias had attended elementary. A man named Howard at the records office, who had been a quiet friend for years without it ever becoming anything else, which suited both of them. Tobias was, by the accounts of teachers and the few school friends who were interviewed after the disappearance, a self-contained young man with a strong academic record and a particular talent for mathematics that his teachers felt bordered on exceptional. He was quiet in the way his mother was quiet. Not shy, exactly, but selective. He had his mother's dark eyes and something of her precision, the habit of watching a situation carefully before committing to a position within it. In the autumn of 2003, Tobias was 17 and in his final year of high school. He had been accepted to an early admission program at a university 4 hours away. He was, by every external measure, on the straightforward trajectory of a capable young person moving toward a larger life. What was not external, what was discovered only later through the painstaking assembly of fragments, was that Tobias had spent the 3 months preceding his disappearance doing something privately, carefully, and with the focused intelligence that characterized everything he applied himself to. He had been investigating Garrett Pell, not because his mother had asked him to. She had explicitly not involved him, had been protective of him in this as in most things, but because Tobias was 17 and observant and had grown up watching his mother's face, and he knew how to read what she was not saying, and what she was not saying in the autumn of 2003 had frightened him enough that he had started paying attention. He had kept notes, a composition book, blue cover, filled in his careful mathematical hand with dates, observations, names, connections. He had kept it hidden in a place that was not found until the house changed hands for the third time in 2019, when a new tenant pulled the baseboard heater away from the wall to fix a rattle and found a composition book taped to the back of it with electrical tape, sealed in a plastic bag. The tenant had contacted the sheriff's office. The composition book had been logged as evidence. It had been reviewed by the investigator on duty, noted, filed, and had not been connected to anything actionable until a detective named Nadia Forsyth was assigned to a cold case review in the spring of 2024 and pulled the Vance file for the first time. She read the composition book in a single sitting. Then she read it again. Then she sat in her office for a long time, looking at the wall. Then she began making calls. Garrett Pell had retired from county government in 2014 at the age of 65. He and his wife Sylvia had relocated to a lake property they owned in an adjacent county, a fact that had been reported in the local paper with the warmth reserved for departing community figures. A photograph of Garrett at his retirement dinner, silver-haired and broad-shouldered, Sylvia beside him in a blue dress, both of them smiling with the ease of people who have spent decades performing ease and have, at some point, stopped being able to distinguish the performance from the thing itself. He was 74 in 2024, and in what appeared, from a distance, to be reasonable health. He still attended the county fair in his home region. He still had his name on the community center. The agricultural scholarship still bore his name and was still awarded annually to a graduating senior. The architecture of his reputation remained intact, undisturbed, aging the way established things age, slowly, gracefully, with the authority of duration. Nadia Forsyth drove past his lake property twice before she spoke to anyone about it. She was 42, 12 years with the county after a previous career with a federal investigative agency that she declined to discuss in detail. She had come to Harlow County by a circuitous route that involved a divorce, a period of extended leave, and a decision to return to the slower pace of county work that she had, over time, come to regard not as a retreat, but as a preference. She was a runner. She kept a list, maintained in a notebook rather than on a phone, of every active case she was responsible for, annotated with what she knew and what she didn't know, and what the gap between those two things suggested. She returned to the list every morning before she did anything else. The Vance case had been on the list since the cold case review assignment. She had flagged it within an hour of reading the initial file. 21 years was a long time. Long enough for evidence to degrade, witnesses to die, memories to reshape themselves around the more comfortable narrative, but also long enough for certain protections to weaken, certain arrangements to shift, certain people who had once been afraid to become less afraid, particularly if the person they had been afraid of was now 74 and living quietly on a lake, and perhaps believed, as people in his position often did after sufficient time had passed, that the past was settled. Tobias Vance's composition book was 47 pages long. The first section documented what Tobias had observed about his mother's behavior from August through October 2003. He wrote in the measured, unemotional way of someone trying to be accurate rather than expressive, cataloging details, the phone calls she took outside, the documents she had photographed at work that she kept in a folder she moved frequently, the name Garrett Pell appearing in her notes on 2 occasions when Tobias had glimpsed them, the way she went still and watchful when the topic of county records came up in conversation. The second section was the result of his own investigation. He was 17 and without resources, but he was methodical and he had access to the school library's newspaper archive and a particular gift for noticing when numbers did not add up. What he had found, working backward through county budget documents that were technically public record, was a pattern of discrepancy in the allocation of a rural infrastructure fund administered through Garrett Pell's office between 1999 and 2003. Money entering the fund from state grants. Money recorded as disbursed to contractors. Contractors, when Tobias cross-referenced their names against business registration records that did not appear to exist. It was not a complete picture. He was 17, not a forensic accountant, and the records he could access were partial, but the outline was clear enough. Clear enough that he had written at the top of the relevant page, underlined twice. Mom found this at work. This is why he is afraid of her. The third section was the shortest. It was dated November 8, 2003, 6 days before the disappearance. It contained a single paragraph. I think he knows she hasn't gone to anyone yet. She's waiting for something. Maybe enough to be certain, maybe for the right person to go to. I don't know why she's waiting, but I'm scared she's waiting too long. I've been trying to find out if there's anyone in the county she can trust with this who isn't connected to Pell somehow. I keep running into walls. I'm going to try Meredith again this weekend. I think Meredith knows more than Mom has told me. Forsyth read that paragraph several times. Then she picked up the phone and called Meredith Cale. Meredith was 68 and retired, and had been, Forsyth would later say, one of the most precisely prepared witnesses she had ever encountered. She had kept notes of her own, not in any organized investigative sense, more in the way of someone who was afraid of forgetting, who had written things down over the years in whatever format was available because the act of writing felt like a form of fidelity to people she had lost. She had dates. She had conversations reconstructed as faithfully as memory allowed. She had the name of the person who had delivered Garrett Pell's alibi on the night of the disappearance, and she had, after 21 years of sitting with it, a theory about why that alibi had held when it probably shouldn't have. The call lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Forsyth hung up and added 4 new names to the list in her notebook. Then she drew a line connecting all of them to a single point at the center. The point was labeled Harlow County Infrastructure Fund, 1999-2003. Who else knew? The alibi had 4 components, and each one was a person. Forsyth laid them out on her desk in the order they had appeared in the 2003 investigation file. Lawrence Bryard, County Roads Supervisor. Donna Spite, Administrative Coordinator for Pell's office. Philip Haas, owner of a local contracting firm. And a man named Arthur Crail, listed simply as a family friend, who had confirmed that Garrett Pell had been present at a private dinner at the Pell residence on the evening of November 14th from approximately 6 p.m. until past midnight. 4 people. 4 independent confirmations. The investigating officer in 2003, a deputy named Stuckey who had since retired to Florida, had noted in his file that the alibi was well corroborated and had moved on. Forsyth looked at the 4 names for a long time. Then she began checking, methodically, the relationship between each person and Garrett Pell's professional life between 1999 and 2003. Lawrence Bryard had overseen the county roads department during the years the infrastructure fund had been active. The fund had, nominally, been designated for rural road improvement. Bryard had signed off on disbursements totaling over $400,000 to contractors whose business registrations Tobias had flagged as non-existent. When Forsyth pulled the original contractor paperwork from county archives, paperwork that had been filed but apparently never rigorously audited, she found that several of the companies shared registered addresses that, when mapped, turned out to be vacant lots or private residences with no commercial presence. Bryard had retired in 2009. He died in 2017. Donna Spite had left county employment in 2005, 2 years after the disappearance, and had relocated to a neighboring state. She was 61 years old and, as of the previous year's voter registration records, still living at the same address she had occupied since 2006. Forsyth placed a call. No answer. She left a message that was careful and non-alarming, a review of a historical case, a few background questions, entirely routine. Donna Spite called back 40 minutes later, which told Forsyth something. People who have nothing to hide generally take their time returning calls from law enforcement. People who have spent years waiting for a particular call sometimes pick up before it stops ringing. The conversation was brief and inconclusive on its surface, Spite confirming her recollection of the alibi dinner, her voice steady and practiced. But twice during the conversation, she paused for slightly longer than the question warranted, and once she said something that she then partially walked back, a sentence that began with, "I always thought it was strange," that before redirecting to something more neutral. Forsyth noted both pauses and the half-sentence and said nothing about them. Philip Haas was the most immediately interesting. His contracting firm, Haas and Associates, was one of the companies whose disbursement records Tobias had flagged. It was, in contrast to the shell entities, a real business with a real commercial history. It had received 2 payments from the Infrastructure Fund in 2001 totaling $68,000. Its records showed no corresponding work performed in the county during that period. Haas himself had expanded his operation significantly in 2002, purchasing new equipment and hiring additional staff, an expansion that was notable given that his pre-2001 financials showed a business that had been marginally profitable for several consecutive years. Haas was 67 and still operating his business. Forsyth drove to his yard on a Wednesday morning unannounced, arriving while he was inspecting equipment with a younger employee. She introduced herself and watched his face very carefully and registered something that was not surprise, not quite, but a quality of arrival, as if he had been anticipating something like this for a long time and had been uncertain only about the timing. She asked him general questions about his work history and watched him answer them with the careful deliberateness of a man who was choosing each word with full awareness of its weight. She asked him about the infrastructure fund. He told her he needed to speak to a lawyer before answering any further questions. That was a different response from the reflexive assertion of innocence she might have expected from someone with nothing to hide. It was the response of someone calculating options. Forsyth thanked him and left. Arthur Crail was the 4th name. He had died in 2015, which closed that particular avenue. But his obituary listed 2 surviving children, a daughter in the city and a son who still lived in the county. Forsyth found the son, a man named Daniel Crail in his 40s, through the county property records. She drove to his address on a Thursday evening, a modest house on the outer edge of town with a truck in the driveway and lights on in the kitchen. Daniel Crail was not what she expected, which meant she had allowed herself to expect something, which was always a professional failing she corrected when she noticed it. He was quiet, slightly built, with the wariness of someone who has carried something uncomfortable for long enough that he was no longer sure he knew how to set it down. He did not ask why she was there. He said, before she had fully introduced herself, "I've been wondering when someone was going to come back to this." She asked him what he meant. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a person making a final calculation. Then he said, "My father didn't go to that dinner that night. He told me that years later, before he died. He said Pell had called him and asked him to say he had been there, and my father was afraid of Pell, afraid of what he knew about some business dealings they'd had. And so he said yes. He said it once, and then he spent the rest of his life not being able to say anything else." Forsyth wrote in her notebook for a long time after Daniel Crail stopped talking. One of 4 alibi witnesses had been fabricated under coercion. The architecture of the alibi, which had stood for 21 years on the strength of 4 names, had a load-bearing wall that had never actually been holding anything. She went home that night and sat at her kitchen table and looked at the list in her notebook, at the lines connecting names to the central point, and she thought about a woman eating supper with her son on a November evening and what had interrupted it, and she thought about a jacket hung over the back of a chair by someone who expected to put it back on shortly. She slept badly. She was up before dawn. She began making calls. The hospital records office, where Rosalind Vance had worked for 14 years, occupied the basement level of Harlow County General, a room of filing cabinets and computer terminals, and the particular institutional quiet of a place where information is stored rather than generated. She had been diligent and precise in her work, which was not surprising given what was known about her character. Medical records management in a county hospital in 2003 was still substantially paper-based. The transition to fully digital systems was underway but incomplete, and Rosalind had navigated both systems with equal competence. Her supervisor had described her, in the original 2003 interview, As the most reliable member of the department and the one most likely to notice when something was filed incorrectly or when a record that should have been present was absent. That last quality was the relevant one. Forsyth requested the complete personnel records for the hospital records department from 1999 through 2003 and sat with them over 2 days, cross-referencing against the infrastructure fund documents that were now spread across the second table in her office. What she was looking for was a connection, the point at which Rosalind's professional world and Garrett Pell's financial activity had intersected. It took her most of the first day to find it. In late 1999, Harlow County General had undertaken a facilities expansion, partially funded through the County Infrastructure Fund. The construction work had been contracted to 2 companies, one of which was Haas and Associates, and the other of which was one of the shell entities Tobias had identified. The hospital had maintained its own records of the project, planning documents, disbursement authorizations, inspection reports. These records had been stored in the hospital records department per standard procedure for capital projects. Someone had requested access to those records in October 2003. The access log, a paper ledger, which was why it had survived, showed the request under a generic county administrator access code. But the log also showed in a different hand that appeared to have been added later to the same entry. A notation, queried by R. Vance Re Cross-Ref Request. Rosalind had been cross-referencing the hospital construction records against something she had been asked to locate by someone using a county administrator code. And in the course of that cross-referencing, she had apparently seen enough to understand what she was looking at. The administrator code, when Forsyth traced it through the county's archived IT records, was registered to Garrett Pell's office. Whether Pell had requested the records himself or whether someone in his office had done so unaware of what they were exposing was unclear. What was clear was that Rosalind had been given access to documents she was not supposed to fully examine and had examined them anyway, because that was the kind of person she was. Careful, precise, the kind who noticed when something was filed incorrectly. Forsyth found Howard Briand, Rosalind's quiet friend from the records office, living in retirement on the western edge of town. He was 73, slightly stooped, with the manner of a man who had grown so accustomed to not discussing something that the habit had become structural. He offered her tea, and she accepted it, and they sat in his front room, and she asked him about Rosalind, and he spoke about her with the careful fondness of someone who had genuinely valued a person and had been grieving them, privately and without fanfare, for 21 years. After a while, she asked him about October 2003. He wrapped both hands around his mug. "She came to me," he said finally, "in the 3rd week of October. She showed me what she had found in the construction records, or part of it, enough to understand the pattern. She asked me if I knew anyone at the state level she could contact, someone outside the county." "And did she find someone?" Forsyth asked. Howard was quiet for a moment. "She was trying to," he said. "She was being careful about it because she understood that Pell had connections and that going to the wrong person would be the same as going to him directly. She had contacted one person at the state auditor's office, a woman she had found through a professional association she belonged to. She had sent some preliminary documents." "What happened with that contact?" Forsyth asked. He looked at his tea. "The woman she contacted left the state auditor's office in December 2003, took a position in another state. I never knew if that was connected or coincidental. By December, Rosalind was already gone." Forsyth put her tea down. She asked, "Did Rosalind ever tell you she was afraid?" Howard's jaw tightened slightly. "The week before she disappeared," he said, "she came to the office looking different." He paused, searching for the right word. "Resolved," he said finally. Like she had made a decision about something and had moved past the fear of it into whatever was on the other side. "She told me she had found one more piece of documentation that made everything conclusive. She said she was going to make copies and get them somewhere safe before she did anything else." "Did she tell you where?" "She said she was going to put them somewhere that wasn't her house. She said she didn't want them at home because of Tobias. She didn't want anything at the house that could come back to him." Forsyth was very still. She thought about a 17-year-old boy who had been conducting his own parallel investigation without his mother's knowledge, who had been trying to protect her at the same time she was trying to protect him. Two people in the same house, carefully hiding their knowledge from each other out of the same love, neither aware of how close they had both come to what they were looking for. She asked Howard if he had any idea where Rosalind might have placed the copies. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "There was a woman at the county clerk's office, a woman named Isabel Trace who had been there since the 80s. Rosalind trusted her. I remember her mentioning that name in those last weeks. I don't know why. Isabel Trace." Forsyth wrote the name down. She was in her car and on her phone before she reached the end of Howard's driveway. Isabel Trace had worked at the Harlow County Clerk's office for 31 years before she retired in 2011, and she had spent every one of those years being exactly the kind of person that institutions depend on and rarely acknowledge. Present, reliable, invisible, in the specific way of someone who has made themselves indispensable through consistency rather than ambition. She was 77 now and lived in a small house on the south side of town with 2 cats and a garden that she tended with the same methodical attention she had once given to filing systems and document protocols. She answered her door on a Friday morning in work clothes, gardening gloves still on, a smear of dark soil along her forearm, and looked at Forsyth's identification with the reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck and said, without any particular alarm, "I thought someone might come eventually. Come in." That phrase, "I thought someone might come eventually," had the quality of a sentence that had been held in reserve for a long time. Forsyth recognized the specific relief in it, the particular exhale of someone who has been keeping a door locked against a room full of something heavy and has finally been given permission to open it. Isabel made coffee with the unhurried efficiency of someone who did not believe in rushing the important things, and Forsyth sat at the kitchen table and waited, watching the older woman move through her kitchen and understanding that the waiting was part of it, that Isabel needed to settle herself, to find the right posture for what she was about to do. She sat down across from Forsyth and wrapped her hands around her mug and said, "Rosalind came to me on a Wednesday, the 2nd week of November, 2003. I remember because it was the day we had the early frost, the one that came before anyone expected it. She came to the office during her lunch hour and she brought a sealed envelope and she asked me to keep it." Forsyth kept her voice neutral. "Did she tell you what was in it?" "She told me it was documentation of financial irregularities in the county infrastructure fund. She told me it implicated Garrett Pell directly and several other individuals. She said she had been trying to find the right channel to report it and hadn't found one she trusted yet, and she needed the document somewhere safe while she kept looking." "Did she say she was afraid?" Isabel looked at her steadily. "She didn't use that word. She said she was being careful. But the way she said it," Isabel paused, choosing her words, "she had the kind of calmness that isn't the absence of fear. It was more like she had looked at the fear directly and decided it wasn't going to change what she was going to do." Forsyth thought of Howard's word. "Resolved. What did you do with the envelope?" Isabel stood and walked to the hallway and came back carrying a shoebox, which she placed on the table between them with the deliberateness of a formal gesture. "The envelope is in here. I kept it because I didn't know what else to do. When Rosalind disappeared, I went to Deputy Stuckey, the investigator, and I told him Rosalind had given me something for safekeeping. He came to the house and I handed it over, and he told me it would be entered into evidence and followed up appropriately." Forsyth kept her face carefully still. 3 weeks later, he came back and returned the envelope, Isabel continued, her voice even. "He told me the contents had been reviewed and determined to be unrelated to the disappearance. He told me to destroy it. He looked at me in a way that I understood was not a suggestion. Then he left." She folded her hands on the table. "I did not destroy it." Forsyth looked at the shoebox. She asked, already knowing part of the answer, "Why not?" "Because Stuckey had worked for Harlow County his entire career," Isabel said simply. "And because 2 days after he returned the envelope to me, I saw him at the Pell Community Center at the annual fundraiser, shaking Garrett Pell's hand and laughing at something Pell had said, and they had the ease of men who had recently done each other a good turn. She pushed the shoebox across the table toward Forsyth. "Rosalind trusted me with this," she said. "I kept it for 21 years because I didn't know who was safe enough to give it to, and I was afraid. And I am not ashamed of the fear because I had seen what happened to a woman who was less afraid than I was. But I am very glad you are here. Please take it." Forsyth opened the envelope at the table with Isabel watching. Inside were 12 pages of photocopied documents, disbursement authorizations, contractor registration records, 2 internal memos on County Infrastructure Fund letterhead, and a handwritten summary in Rosalind's precise hospital-trained notation that cross-referenced the disbursements against the non-existent contractors and calculated the total discrepancy. The figure at the bottom of the summary page was $843,000. Below the figure, Rosalind had written 4 names. Garrett Pell at the top, Lawrence Briard below it, Philip Haas, and a 4th name that Forsyth had not encountered yet in her investigation. A name she now wrote into her own notebook and circled twice. County Auditor Warren Gilby, who had been in his position since 1997 and was still, as of the current year, serving in the same role. Forsyth drove back to her office in a state of focused quiet, the shoebox on the passenger seat beside her. She thought about Stuckey, now retired in Florida, who had taken the evidence and returned it and told Isabel to destroy it. She thought about Warren Gilby still sitting in his county auditor's chair. She thought about Philip Haas asking for his lawyer. She thought about the elaborate architecture of protection that had surrounded Garrett Pell for 21 years. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just the quiet interlocking of favors and fear and mutual self-interest that small-scale corruption always turned out to be built from when you finally got inside it. She thought about what it had cost. 2 people who ate supper one evening and then did not exist anymore. She called the State Investigative Bureau that afternoon and spoke for 40 minutes with a senior agent she had worked with previously and trusted. She outlined what she had, what she needed, and what she believed the documentation in the envelope would support. She was precise and unemotional, and she finished by saying that she believed there was sufficient basis for a formal investigation with state-level jurisdiction and that she would courier the original documents that afternoon. Then she sat in her office after the call ended and let herself feel, briefly and privately, the weight of what was in the shoebox and what it had meant that it had sat in an old woman's hallway for 21 years while a case went cold and a family dissolved around the space left by 2 people who had deserved far better than what they had received. She gave herself 3 minutes. Then she went back to the list. The State Investigative Bureau moved carefully and without announcement. That was the nature of the work when local corruption was involved. The ordinary channels were compromised by definition, and the geometry of who knew whom and who owed what to whom extended in ways that were not always visible until you were already inside them. The lead agent assigned to the case, a methodical woman named Priya Santosh, who had spent a decade working financial crime before moving to the Bureau's Special Investigations Unit, spent the first 3 weeks simply mapping the network before making a single direct contact. She and Forsyth spoke daily. They built the picture together, each contributing what her particular angle of approach could see, and the picture that emerged was not surprising in its broad shape. This kind of arrangement was common enough that experienced investigators had an almost architectural sense of how it was structured before they could prove any specific component, but was specific and detailed and, by the 5th week, sufficiently documented to proceed. Donna Spite had called back. Not the careful, practiced call of 3 weeks earlier, but a different kind of call. Longer, less controlled, made from a cell phone while she was sitting in her car in a supermarket parking lot 3 states away because she had not wanted to make it from inside her own house. She talked for over an hour. She confirmed the alibi dinner had taken place but that it had ended by 9:30 p.m. She confirmed that she had been told, by Pell directly, that it was important that everyone recalled the evening lasting until past midnight. She said she had been afraid. She said she had told herself for 21 years that Rosalind's disappearance was probably unrelated, that she had probably just left, that she had probably had reasons no one knew about, and that she had known, underneath that story, that it was not true, and that the knowing had lived in her like something low-grade and chronic that she had simply learned to carry. Warren Gilby, the county auditor, was approached by Santosh directly and without advance notice on a Tuesday morning, intercepted as he arrived at the county building. He was 68 and had been in the role long enough that its procedures and protections had become a kind of identity. The sudden appearance of a State Bureau investigator on the sidewalk outside his workplace at 8 in the morning had the effect of pulling a structural element out of something that had been bearing weight for a long time. He sat down on the steps of the building, which he did not appear to do deliberately, and looked at Santosh's identification for an extended period. He asked for immunity before he said anything substantive. Santosh told him that was a conversation for lawyers and prosecutors, and that she was not in a position to make offers, but that the degree of cooperation extended at this stage generally influenced what positions were available later. He hired a lawyer by noon. By end of the week, through the lawyer, he had provided a preliminary statement that confirmed the infrastructure fund discrepancies and identified the mechanism by which they had been concealed in the audit records. Philip Haas, who had been waiting for his moment since Forsyth appeared in his yard, retained separate counsel and reached a cooperation agreement within 10 days of being formally approached by the Bureau. His testimony was detailed and specific and covered not only the financial arrangements, but several conversations with Pell in the autumn of 2003 in which Pell had indicated, in language that was careful but unmistakable, that a problem with a county employee had been resolved. Haas claimed he had understood this to mean that Rosalind had been persuaded to stay quiet. He said he had told himself that, and had maintained that position in his own mind with considerable effort for over 2 decades. He said he was aware this was not credible, and that he was not asking anyone to believe it. Forsyth interviewed him herself after the formal cooperation process was underway. She asked him only one question outside the scope of the financial investigation. She asked, "Did Pell ever say anything about Tobias, about the son?" Haas looked at his hands for a long time. He said, "Pell mentioned once that he had heard the boy was sharp. He said it the way you might mention a liability." Forsyth thanked him and ended the interview. The arrest of Garrett Pell took place on a Thursday morning in late autumn, 21 years and approximately 11 months after Rosalind and Tobias Vance had disappeared. A State Bureau team drove to the lake property at 7 a.m. Pell answered the door in a bathrobe. His wife Sylvia stood in the hallway behind him, and her expression, according to the agent who noted it in the arrest report, was not shock. It was the expression of someone who has been dreading a particular knock for a very long time and has finally heard it. Stuckey, the retired deputy, was arrested the same morning at his home in Florida. 2 additional county employees were taken into custody before noon. The news broke that afternoon. Harlow County received it the way small towns receive the collapse of a fixture, with a period of collective silence, a suspension, before the reactions sorted themselves into the camps that always emerged in these situations. Those who had known something was wrong and felt a grim vindication. Those who were genuinely shocked and required time to reconstruct their understanding of things they had thought they knew, and those who had been connected to Pell in ways that now required urgent reassessment. Meredith Cale heard the news on her phone while she was making dinner. She sat down at her kitchen table and covered her mouth with both hands and stayed very still for a long time. She thought about the argument, the things she had and hadn't said, the name she had given to the police in 2003 that had gone nowhere. She thought about Rosalind's voice on the phone, the last call, the one that had ended badly, the one she had been replaying in one form or another for 21 years, the specific quality of Rosalind's certainty, the way she had said, "I can handle it. I know what I'm doing. Stay out of it." She had been so certain. Meredith thought about what certainty costs sometimes. Then she thought about what her sister had done with that certainty, what she had gathered and documented and tried to protect and tried to report, and she decided that the word for it was not naive or mistaken. The word for it was brave. She sat with that for a long time in her quiet kitchen while the news kept coming through her phone. Outside, the evening settled over the street the way evenings do, indifferent to everything below it, darkening with the same patience it had darkened every evening before this one and would darken every evening after. The search warrant for Garrett Pell's lake property was executed on the same morning as the arrest. It was a substantial property, 4 acres of mixed woodland and cleared lawn running down to a private dock, a main house of considerable size, a detached garage, and a storage structure at the property's northern edge that had been built sometime in the late 1990s and appeared on the original planning application as a boat storage facility. The structure was constructed of poured concrete with a reinforced floor, which was not standard for a boat storage building, and which the State Bureau's forensic team noted in their initial assessment with the particular quiet that experienced investigators use when something is significant and they are not yet ready to say how significant. Forsyth was present by special arrangement. Santosh had allowed it as a professional courtesy with the understanding that Forsyth would observe and not direct. She stood at the edge of the cleared area near the dock and watched the forensic team move through the property in their systematic way, and she felt the particular stillness that comes when an investigation arrives at the place it has been moving toward, and the next thing to happen will be irreversible. The lake itself was cold and dark, with the particular opacity of deep fresh water in late autumn, the surface holding the flat gray of the sky above it without reflection. Harlow County's largest natural body of water, it extended approximately 2 miles in its longest dimension and reached depths of 60 feet in its central basin. It was used for recreational fishing and had been a selling point in the original property listing that had brought Pell to this location in his retirement. The concrete storage structure was opened first. What the forensic team found inside was not a boat. There were 2 aluminum storage lockers along the rear wall, padlocked, and a central space that had been cleared recently enough that the concrete floor showed the clean rectangular outline of something large that had stood there and been removed. Drag marks in the surface grime indicated the direction of removal toward the structure's rear wall, which backed directly onto the lake bank. Forsyth stood outside and watched the forensic team work and kept her face still. The dive team was in the water by mid-afternoon. Diving in late autumn in a freshwater lake of that depth is slow, methodical work, conducted in low visibility with equipment that compensates only partially for the conditions. The team worked a grid pattern beginning from the point directly off the rear of the storage structure, moving outward in measured increments. Forsyth stood on the dock and watched the surface and thought about patience, about the specific kind of patience that investigation requires. The willingness to be present for what comes without forcing the pace of it. The first significant discovery came at 4:17 p.m., logged precisely because that is how these things are done, because the recording of the moment is itself a form of witness. A weighted container, steel construction, padlocked, approximately the dimensions of a large trunk, the kind manufactured for outdoor storage or maritime use, the kind built to resist the elements indefinitely. It took 2 hours to bring it to the surface carefully and transport it to the forensic processing area set up in the main house garage. The lock was cut. Santosh and the lead forensic examiner opened it while Forsyth stood 3 feet back and maintained the posture of an observer. What was inside confirmed what the investigation had been building toward for months and what Forsyth had understood, at some level, since she had first read Tobias Vance's composition book in her office and felt the particular quality of dread that comes from following a logic to its conclusion. She left the garage and walked to the dock and stood there in the cold and looked at the water for a long time. She was not someone who cried readily or publicly, and she did not cry now. But she allowed herself, standing alone on that dock in the November cold with the light going out of the sky, to feel the full weight of it, of what had been done, and when, and that it had been done to a woman who had been trying to do the right thing and a boy who had been trying to protect his mother, and that both of them had been alone when it happened, and that the person responsible had then driven to a county fundraiser and shaken hands and smiled and spent 21 years being a landmark. She stood there until it was fully dark. Then she went back inside and did her job. The second container was found the following morning in deeper water, 40 feet out from the first recovery point. The dive team had continued working after dark with underwater lighting equipment and had located it on the lake floor, partially silted over, which suggested it had been there longer. The forensic analysis would later establish that it had been placed there in November 2003, within days of the disappearance. The identification of both sets of remains took 3 weeks, the process slowed by the conditions of the lake and the duration of submersion. Dental records were the primary method. Rosalind's from the hospital she had attended in Harlow, Tobias's from the dentist he had seen since childhood, whose records had been preserved in storage by a practice that had changed hands twice but maintained its archives. Meredith received the formal confirmation in a phone call from Forsyth, who had insisted on making the call herself rather than delegating it. Meredith already knew. She had known since the news of the arrest, had known in the way you know things that you have been preparing for without admitting the preparation, but hearing it spoken with certainty produced a different kind of knowing, a more complete one, and she sat with it for a long time after the call ended. She asked Forsyth one question before they said goodbye. She asked whether Rosalind would have known, at the end, that she had been right, that she had found something real, that it had been worth what she had done. Forsyth thought about the documents in the envelope, the careful handwritten summary, the figure at the bottom of the page, the 4 names. She said, she knew. She had everything she needed. She was on her way to making it count. Meredith said thank you in a voice that was barely audible. Forsyth said, your sister was the reason this case ever had anything to work with. Everything we found because of what she documented and what she protected and what she refused to let go of. Without Rosalind, there is no case. There was a long silence on the line. Then Meredith said, she would have been embarrassed to hear that. She would have said she was just doing what anyone would do. Forsyth said, most people don't. Another silence. Then Meredith said quietly, no, I suppose they don't. The trial of Garrett Pell on charges including conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, financial fraud, and abuse of public office began in the spring of the following year and lasted 11 weeks. It was covered extensively. The combination of elements made it the kind of case that attracts sustained attention. The small-town corruption story collapsed against the disappearance story, collapsed against the forensic story of what the lake had held, each component amplifying the others. The courtroom in the county seat was full every day of proceedings. Camera crews positioned themselves outside the building each morning with the patience of people who understood they were witnessing something that would be referenced for a long time. Forsyth attended every day she was not required elsewhere. She sat in the gallery rather than at the prosecution table. The State Bureau conducted the prosecution, and she was a witness, called in the 3rd week to present her investigative findings in the careful, sequential manner that courtroom testimony requires. She spoke for 4 hours across 2 sessions. She was precise and thorough, and she answered every question put to her by both sides without ornamentation, because the facts, presented plainly, required nothing added to them. The defense mounted a case built primarily on reasonable doubt and the distance of time, arguing that the forensic evidence was subject to interpretation, that the testimony of cooperating witnesses was self-interested, that 21 years of elapsed time made certainty impossible. It was a professional effort, and it was not sufficient. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Guilty on all counts. The sentencing hearing was 2 months later. Pell stood in the courtroom in a dark suit that had been tailored for a larger version of himself and had not been adjusted for the weight he had lost since his arrest. He was 74 years old and stood with the careful uprightness of someone who had spent decades presenting themselves as solid and had maintained the posture past the point of any structural support. His wife Sylvia was not present. She had filed for divorce 4 months earlier and had not appeared at any point during the proceedings. Meredith Cale read a victim impact statement. She had written it over the course of 3 weeks, revising it repeatedly, reading it aloud to herself in her kitchen until she could get through it without stopping. She delivered it in a clear, even voice, looking at the courtroom rather than at the page after the first few lines, because she had memorized it well enough not to need it, and because she wanted to say it looking at people rather than at paper. She spoke about Rosalind, not about what had been done to her, but about who she had been, the precision of her, the particular dry warmth of her humor, the way she had raised a son alone and without complaint and with considerable success, the way she had been right about something important and had tried to do something about it through the proper channels, and when the proper channels failed her, had kept trying, because that was the kind of person she was. She spoke about Tobias. She spoke about a 17-year-old boy who had been protecting his mother without knowing she was protecting him, both of them operating in parallel out of love, and about what that boy might have become. The mathematician, the precise, quiet intelligence of him, the university place he had earned and would never use. She spoke about the argument. She had decided to include it because leaving it out would have felt like a form of dishonesty, and Rosalind had raised her to believe that dishonesty was a weakness even when it was comfortable. She said, "I told her to stop and come away from it, and she told me she could handle it, and we argued, and then she was gone. I have thought about that argument every day for 21 years. I have arrived, after all of it, at this understanding, that she was right and I was wrong. Not about the danger was real, but about what the right thing was to do. She saw it clearly, and she did it anyway, and there is a word for that, and the word is courage. And the person in this courtroom who should carry the weight of what happened to her is not Rosalind." She looked at Pell when she said the last sentence. He looked at the table in front of him. Pell received consecutive sentences totaling 47 years, which the judge noted frankly was effectively a life sentence given the defendant's age, and which she delivered without apology. Stuckey received 12 years for obstruction, conspiracy, and evidence tampering. Warren Gilby, whose cooperation had been substantive and whose direct involvement in the disappearances could not be established beyond his knowledge and concealment, received 7 years and forfeiture of his pension. Philip Haas, whose cooperation agreement reflected his significant assistance to the prosecution, received a suspended sentence and a substantial fine. The Pell Community Center was renamed by a vote of the town council within 30 days of the verdict. The agricultural scholarship was discontinued. The photograph of Garrett Pell from his retirement dinner, the one that had appeared in the local paper with Sylvia in her blue dress, was removed from the newspaper's online archive, though the removal was noted and discussed by people who felt that erasure was itself a distortion of history, and that the photograph should remain visible precisely because it showed what comfortable, long-established criminality looked like from the outside. Forsyth went back to her office after the sentencing and sat at her desk and looked at her list. She drew a line through the Vance case, not through the names, she never drew lines through names, but through the case designation in the margin. A single horizontal line. She looked at it for a moment. Then she turned the page. There were other names. There were always other names. The work did not conclude, it simply moved, case by case, through the accumulated catalog of things that had been done and not yet answered for, and the only response to that fact that Forsyth had ever found adequate was to keep moving through it with whatever care and patience the work required. She made a note at the top of the next page. She picked up the phone. She began again. Meredith Cale went to Mercer Lane on the first warm day in May, the kind of day that arrives in early spring before the season has fully committed and carries in it the particular tenderness of things beginning again after a long time of not beginning. The house had been sold the previous autumn. The estate had finally cleared, the legal proceedings having resolved the last outstanding questions of ownership, and the new owners were a young couple from the city who had bought it knowing its history because it was a good house at a fair price and because they had decided, practically and without drama, that the history of a house and the house itself were separate things and the house deserved to be lived in properly. They had painted it. The porch had been repaired. There were curtains in the front windows and a pot of something green and early on the front step. The small yard had been cleared and someone had recently turned the soil in the flower beds along the front walk, the dark earth raked into readiness. Meredith stood on the sidewalk across the street and looked at it for a while. She had not been back to Harlow since the sentencing. She had not been certain she would come back at all. But May had arrived with its particular quality of insistence, and she had found herself in the car on a Tuesday morning, driving west on the county highway, with no specific plan beyond the need to see the street, to place herself on it once more and see what it asked of her. The street was quiet. A neighbor 2 doors down was washing a car in the driveway. A child was visible in a yard further along, absorbed in something on the ground, examining an insect, possibly, or a stone, or whatever small things absorb children on the first warm mornings of the year. An ordinary Tuesday on an ordinary street. She thought about the last evening. She had thought about it so many times over 21 years that the imagining of it had taken on a quality of texture. She could move through it almost spatially, placing Rosalind and Tobias in the kitchen, the 2 plates on the table, the television on, Tobias's jacket on the back of the chair. The ordinary, reliable furniture of a life being lived. She had not been there that evening, but she had constructed it from everything she knew of her sister and her nephew and the house they had occupied. And the construction had been so thorough and so repeated that it had become, in some functional sense, a memory. What she found, standing on Mercer Lane in May with the new owner's spring garden taking shape in the flower beds, was that the construction had changed slightly. That what she saw when she placed herself in that kitchen now was not only the ending of the evening, the door standing open in the morning, the food not quite cold, but the wholeness of it, the living of it. 2 people who had eaten supper together and talked and watched whatever they watched and been, in the particular unremarkable way of people who are safe and fed and together, fine. Who had been fine right up until they weren't, and who had been themselves, fully and completely themselves, until the last possible moment. Rosalind had been right about something important and had tried to do something about it. Tobias had been sharp and careful and full of a future he had done nothing to forfeit. These things were true in a way that the ending of their story did not alter, and Meredith had been arriving at that understanding gradually for the better part of a year and was not fully there yet, but was closer than she had been. She had started a foundation. It was early, still in its organizational stages, run from her kitchen table with the assistance of a young woman who had done this kind of work before. Its focus was on supporting whistleblowers, people in institutional positions who had found something wrong and were trying to find a safe channel to report it, people who were navigating exactly the terrain that Rosalind had navigated alone and without guidance. It would offer legal referrals, documentation support, secure reporting channels, the kind of practical infrastructure that might have made a difference on a Wednesday in October 2003, when a woman in a basement records office understood what she was looking at and needed to know what to do next. She had named it the Vance Foundation. She had considered and rejected 2 other names before arriving at that one, which was the right one because it was Rosalind's name and Tobias's name, and the naming was itself a form of continuation. A car turned onto Mercer Lane and passed her and pulled into the driveway of the house. The young woman who got out, one of the new owners presumably, had a grocery bag in each arm and glanced at Meredith with the neutral curiosity of someone noting a stranger on her street without concern. Meredith raised a hand in greeting. The woman smiled briefly and went inside. The door closed. The street settled back into its Tuesday quiet. The child further along the block had moved to a different part of the yard and was examining something new. The person washing the car had finished and gone inside. The spring air carried the particular smell of turned earth and new growth that arrives for a few weeks each year and then changes into something else, the way seasons always do, not ending exactly, just becoming the next thing, patient and continuous. Meredith stood on the sidewalk a little longer. Then she walked back to her car, started the engine, and drove out of Harlow County on the highway going east, toward the city, toward her kitchen table and the work that was waiting on it. She did not look in the rearview mirror as she went. She had found, over the course of the past year, that she was becoming better at facing forward, that the past did not require her constant vigilance to remain true, that Rosalind and Tobias existed in a place that did not need her to keep looking back in order to stay intact. They were there. They had been there. Nothing that had happened or would happen could undo the fact of them. The precision and the courage, and the boy with his composition book, and his mother who had known what she knew and had refused to unknow it. Meredith kept her eyes on the road. The highway opened out ahead of her, long and straight, the farmland on either side of it green with the first real growth of the year. She drove,